I served Count Dooku for 7 years before I understood what he had become, and by then I had become something unrecognizable myself, standing in the ruins of what I'd believed was a noble cause, while the screaming of the dying echoed through corridors I could no longer escape, even in sleep. My name is Genza Arandis, and I was his personal aide from the beginning of the separatist movement until 3 months before Geonosis, when I finally saw with clarity what my loyalty had been feeding, what noble intentions had curdled into, and I ran. I've been running ever since, from world to world in the Outer Rim, using false names and forged credentials, staying ahead of the assassins he sends periodically to silence me, not because I know military secrets, those would be obsolete by now, but because I witnessed the transformation day by day, moment by moment, and that testimony is more dangerous than any tactical intelligence could ever be. I met him on Sereno when I was 23, fresh from Administrative Academy on Coruscant, with certifications in diplomatic protocol and organizational logistics assigned to his estate through official Republic channels because even then, before the formal break, Count Dooku required someone to manage the increasing volume of correspondence, the visitors, the complex financial arrangements that came with being both nobility and a former Jedi Master who'd retained considerable influence despite his departure from the Order. The estate was beautiful in a way that made you forget the galaxy beyond its walls. Ancient stone architecture rising from manicured gardens, libraries containing texts centuries old, halls decorated with art collected across generations of his family's stewardship of Sereno. He was courteous when we met, formal but not cold, explaining my duties with patience and precision, answering my nervous questions with the kind of attention that made you feel intelligent for asking. He was 65 then, though he carried himself with the vigor of someone decades younger, his beard elegantly trimmed, his posture perfect, his voice cultured and measured. When he spoke about the Republic's failings, about the corruption in the Senate and the Jedi Order's complicity in political decay, it sounded like the reasoned critique of an elder statesman, someone with enough experience and distance to see patterns invisible to those still embedded in the system. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? I'd grown up in the mid-rim watching Republic governance fail my homeworld repeatedly, relief supplies delayed by bureaucratic procedure while people starved, trade disputes escalated into violence because no one in the Senate cared enough to intervene efficiently. Dooku's vision of a reformed government, one that actually served its citizens rather than exploiting them, one that recognized the needs of systems outside the core, resonated with my own frustrations. When he began organizing what he called the Separatist Alliance, recruiting systems dissatisfied with Republic rule, I threw myself into the work with genuine enthusiasm. I coordinated meetings, drafted communications, managed the logistics of a growing political movement. The work was challenging and purposeful. I felt like I was part of something important, something that might actually change the galaxy for the better. The first year was intoxicating. System after system joined the alliance, each one adding momentum, validating the movement's legitimacy. Dooku traveled constantly, meeting with planetary leaders, delivering speeches that combined philosophical depth with practical political analysis. I accompanied him to most of these meetings, taking notes, managing schedules, ensuring everything ran smoothly. He treated me not as a subordinate, but as a colleague, often asking my opinion on tactical matters, explaining his strategies, including me in planning sessions. I was young enough and idealistic enough to be flattered by the attention, to interpret his trust as evidence of my own capabilities rather than as manipulation, which of course it was. A carefully calibrated investment in my loyalty that would pay dividends later, when loyalty became compliance and compliance became silence about things that should have been screamed from every holonet node in the galaxy. The changes began subtly, so gradually, that each individual shift seemed insignificant, justifiable, a reasonable adaptation to evolving circumstances. The first was his insistence on increased security. We'd received threats. That was undeniable. Political movements always attracted extremists. And hiring additional guards, implementing stricter protocols for visitors. These seemed prudent rather than paranoid. But the guards he hired weren't standard security personnel. They moved wrong, too fluid, too aware, and they carried themselves with the particular stillness of people trained to kill efficiently. I asked him once about their background, and he smiled and said they were former military specialists whose skills were being wasted in the Republic's bloated defense apparatus. And that answer satisfied me because I wanted to be satisfied, wanted to believe his explanations because believing was easier than doubting. Then came the shifts in rhetoric. Dooku's speeches had always criticized Republic corruption, but they'd emphasized positive alternatives, constructive visions for better governance. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the tone darkened. The corruption wasn't just institutional failure, but moral decay. The Jedi weren't merely politically compromised, but actively malicious, enforcing Republic hegemony through manipulation and violence. The core worlds weren't simply privileged, but parasitic, deliberately exploiting the outer rim in a relationship that could only be corrected through confrontation. I noticed the changes but rationalized them as rhetorical escalation, the natural intensification of political discourse as opposition hardened. The Republic was responding to the separatist movement with increasing hostility. After all, blockading systems that tried to leave, threatening sanctions, deploying military forces to contested regions. Dooku's harsher language seemed like appropriate response to Republic aggression rather than cause for concern about his state of mind. 6 months into my service, I met the others. Not the public faces of the Separatist Alliance, not the planetary representatives and Trade Federation officials who attended the formal conferences. The others were introduced as advisors, specialists in various fields whose expertise Dooku valued for strategic planning. There was Severance Tan, a Chiss woman whose military background was obvious in her bearing and whose eyes held the kind of emptiness I'd later recognize as evidence of things experienced that couldn't be unexperienced. There was Tall Score, who claimed to be a former Jedi, but whose presence felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate, like standing near machinery that vibrated at a frequency just below hearing, unsettling without obvious cause. There was Cadrian Say, young and intense, who looked at Dooku with something between reverence and hunger, and there were others who came and went, never introduced by name, wearing dark robes, speaking in low voices. Gathering in rooms I wasn't permitted to enter but could hear through the estate's old walls, voices chanting in languages I didn't recognize, sounds that might have been music or might have been screaming, the distinction unclear. I asked Dooku about them carefully, obliquely, mentioning how unusual some of his advisors seemed. He regarded me with that penetrating gaze he had, the one that made you feel simultaneously seen and transparent, and told me that unconventional problems required unconventional solutions, that the Republic's greatest weakness was its rigid adherence to failed methodologies, and that true leadership meant embracing whatever tools and talents might serve the cause regardless of their origins. It sounded wise. It sounded like the kind of pragmatic flexibility that distinguished great leaders from mediocre bureaucrats. I accepted the explanation and stopped asking questions, which was precisely what he'd intended. Each interaction calibrated to establish boundaries, to train me incrementally toward the kind of assistant who executed orders without interrogating their foundations. The nightmares started around month 8. Not every night, just occasionally, dreams where I walked through the estate's corridors and they stretched impossibly, geometry defying itself, doors opening onto rooms that couldn't exist in the physical structure, and in those rooms I saw things I couldn't quite remember upon waking, but that left residue, emotional stains of horror and grief. I attributed them to stress. The workload was intense, the political situation increasingly volatile. I was young and working 18-hour days in high-pressure circumstances. Nightmares seemed like normal psychological response to abnormal demands. I didn't mention them to anyone, certainly not to Dooku, who I wanted to see as competent and unshakable. Month 10, he began teaching me, not formally, not as though he'd decided to take on a student, but through casual conversations that became philosophical discussions that became something else entirely. He'd ask my opinion on ethical dilemmas, scenarios where traditional morality broke down, where competing goods created impossible choices. If you could save millions by sacrificing thousands, was the calculation simple or complex? If you could end a war by committing an atrocity, did the outcome justify the means? If you knew with certainty that maintaining order required periodic violence, was that violence murder or necessity? The questions fascinated me in their intellectual complexity, and I engaged with them eagerly, developing arguments, exploring nuances, never quite noticing how each discussion pulled me further into a framework where morality became situational, where traditional ethics dissolved into cost-benefit analysis, where the only real value was effectiveness in service of ultimate goals. He told me about the Jedi during one of these conversations, about his years in the Order, about the hypocrisy he'd witnessed, about how an institution claiming to serve peace had become an enforcement arm of a corrupt Senate, about how Jedi Masters counseled detachment while involving themselves intimately in political affairs, about how they took children from families and indoctrinated them into a philosophy that denied fundamental aspects of being alive. His critiques were sophisticated, difficult to refute, supported by specific examples from his own experience. I found myself agreeing, found myself angry on his behalf for what he'd endured, found myself accepting his narrative about the Jedi's fall from their own principles. What I didn't recognize until much later was how this narrative prepared me to accept worse revelations, how by establishing the Jedi as flawed and hypocritical, he created conceptual space for presenting alternatives that would have seemed monstrous without that foundation. Month 12, the estate underwent renovations. Dooku explained that we needed more secure facilities for sensitive meetings, better shielded communications equipment, reinforced structures to protect against potential Republic attacks. Construction crews arrived and began work on a sub-level beneath the main estate, carving into the bedrock, installing systems I wasn't permitted to observe directly. The construction sounds were constant for weeks: drilling, excavation, heavy machinery, and beneath those industrial noises, I sometimes heard other sounds, especially at night, especially when I was falling asleep or waking. Sounds that might have been the wind in the old stone walls, or might have been whispering, voices speaking words just below the threshold of comprehension. When the sub-level was completed, access was restricted. Only Dooku and his inner circle of advisors were permitted entry, requiring biometric authentication and access codes that changed daily. I was responsible for managing his schedule, which meant I knew when he went down to the sub-level and approximately how long he spent there, but never what he did. The visits were frequent, sometimes multiple times daily, sometimes for hours at a stretch. When he emerged, he looked tired in a particular way, not physically exhausted but drained, emptied, and his eyes held something they hadn't before, a coldness that surfaced occasionally when he thought no one was observing him, a flatness that suggested vast distances behind his gaze. Around month 15, the medical visits began. Dooku had always been healthy, vigorously so, but he started requesting that specific physicians visit the estate, specialists in fields I couldn't identify from their credentials. They arrived quietly, stayed briefly, departed without speaking to anyone except him. I managed their travel arrangements and compensation, but never learned what services they provided. After their visits, Dooku would often spend days in his private chambers, emerging looking somehow renewed, younger, more vital than he had any right to be for his age. I told myself he was simply receiving preventative care, managing the aging process with the kind of advanced medical interventions available to the wealthy. I told myself this despite knowing, somewhere beneath rationalization, that the explanation was insufficient, that something else was happening in those sessions, something I didn't want to examine too closely. The first time I saw him truly angry was month 17, when a Republic investigation into separatist financial networks threatened to expose certain arrangements he'd made with the banking clan. I was in his office when he received the news via encrypted transmission. His face remained calm, but the temperature in the room dropped perceptibly, my breath suddenly visible, frost forming on the windows despite the season. The datapad he'd been holding crumpled in his hand as if made of flimsy plast, metal crumpling, circuits sparking. He stood motionless for perhaps 30 seconds, and during that time I felt pressure in my skull, behind my eyes, a sensation like someone pressing their thumbs into my temples from the inside. Then it passed. The temperature normalized. He looked at me and smiled and said in a perfectly even voice that the situation would be handled, that I shouldn't concern myself, that minor obstacles were inevitable in any significant undertaking. The officials leading that investigation died 3 days later in a transport accident. The official report cited mechanical failure. I knew better. I didn't know how Dooku had arranged it, didn't know if he'd hired assassins or utilized some other method, but I knew with absolute certainty that those deaths were his work, that the convenient timing wasn't coincidence but causation. I should have resigned then, should have recognized that line being crossed for what it was, evidence that this movement I'd believed was about reform and justice was actually about power, that Dooku's noble rhetoric masked simpler and darker motivations. But I didn't resign. I rationalized. Those officials were corrupt, probably. They were defending a broken system. Their deaths were unfortunate, but perhaps they'd been complicit in greater crimes, and weren't we trying to prevent larger catastrophes, and didn't extraordinary circumstances sometimes require extreme measures? I talked myself into accepting murder by drowning it in abstract justifications, and in doing so I became complicit. I crossed a threshold in my own conscience that couldn't be uncrossed. Month 20, the battle droids arrived, not to the estate directly, but to facilities elsewhere on Sereno and other separatist-controlled worlds. I processed the financial arrangements, vast sums flowing to the Trade Federation and Techno-Union, purchases that dwarfed anything the movement had acquired previously. When I asked Dooku about the scale of these military preparations, he explained that the Republic was mobilizing for war, that the Jedi were pushing for military intervention against the Alliance, that we needed defensive capabilities to protect member systems from inevitable aggression. It made sense. The galaxy was polarizing rapidly. Conflict seemed unavoidable. Being prepared was rational. But something in his tone when he discussed the droids unsettled me, a satisfaction that went beyond strategic calculation, an eagerness that suggested he wasn't preparing for war defensively, but anticipating it, welcoming it as opportunity rather than tragedy to avoid. Around this time, the nature of visitors to the estate changed. Fewer diplomats and system representatives, more military commanders and corporate executives. Fewer discussions about governance philosophy and more about logistics, production capacity, supply chains, strategic targets. The Separatist alliance was transforming from political movement into military organization, and that transformation happened so gradually, through so many incremental steps, that I never identified a single moment to object, never saw a clear line that definitively separated legitimate dissent from armed rebellion. Each meeting seemed justified by the previous one, each escalation a response to Republic provocation, each weapons purchase a reasonable precaution given Republic military buildups. I met Newt Gunray during month 22 when he visited the estate for extended strategy sessions with Dooku. He was obsequious and cowardly, clearly frightened of Dooku while trying to maintain his own authority as Viceroy of the Trade Federation. I disliked him immediately, found his mannerisms grating, his obvious self-interest repugnant. What disturbed me more was watching Dooku interact with him, the contempt barely concealed behind courtesy, the way Dooku manipulated him through flattery and veiled threats, extracting commitments and resources while clearly viewing Gunray as a useful tool rather than an ally. It was masterful and disgusting, and it made me wonder how Dooku viewed me, whether my belief in our shared purpose was genuine or whether I too was just a tool he'd cultivated, shaped, deployed toward ends I couldn't see. Month 25 brought the Force-sensitive children. They arrived in small groups, escorted by those nameless advisors in dark robes, brought to the estate's sub-level and kept there for days or weeks before disappearing to other locations. I was told they were war orphans. Force-sensitive individuals rescued from Republic-controlled territory where the Jedi would have taken them for indoctrination, that Dooku was protecting them from that fate while teaching them to use their abilities freely, without the Jedi's restrictive philosophy. But I heard them sometimes, late at night, heard crying that sounded wrong, too sustained, too anguished, heard sounds that might have been training exercises or might have been something else entirely. I told myself I was misinterpreting, that my own unease was projecting darkness onto innocent circumstances, but I started avoiding the sections of the estate nearest the sub-level access, started requesting schedule adjustments that kept me away during certain hours, started doing anything I could to maintain plausible deniability about what was happening below. That was when I began keeping records. Not comprehensively, not systematically, just small notes to myself, fragments of conversations that disturbed me, financial transactions that seemed suspicious, observations about Dooku's behavior that worried me. I encrypted them, hid them in personal files I told myself were just diaries, just my own processing of a stressful situation. But really, I was documenting, preserving evidence, some part of me already understanding that testimony would matter eventually, that someone needed to remember what was being done and how it happened, even if that someone was just my future self trying to make sense of complicity. Month 28, I went into the sub-level, not intentionally, not as deliberate investigation, but through accident and opportunity converging. Dooku was off-world for meetings. Most of his inner circle had traveled with him, and I was working late on routine administrative tasks when I realized I'd left a datapad I needed in the secure storage room adjacent to the sub-level access. The storage room required authentication I possessed, but the sub-level beyond required additional credentials I didn't have. Except when I entered the storage room, the sub-level access door was open, just slightly. Someone having left carelessly or deliberately, I never knew which. I should have simply retrieved my datapad and departed. I didn't. I approached the door, listened for movement or voices, heard nothing, and descended. The stairway was longer than the estate's structure should have permitted, curving downward through the bedrock, walls that were bare stone rather than finished surfaces, lighting that came from bioluminescent strips whose glow was faintly red, making my hands look blood-stained when I held them up. At the bottom was a corridor with multiple doors, all sealed, and I walked past them, reading the placards that labeled each: Training Chamber 3, Meditation Cell 7, Specimen Storage, Alchemical Laboratory, Holocron Archive. The last door at the corridor's end was unlocked. I opened it. The room beyond was large and circular, with a domed ceiling carved with symbols I recognized from the oldest texts in Dooku's library, symbols associated with the Sith, the ancient enemies of the Jedi, the dark side practitioners whose religion had been extinct for a millennium, according to everything I'd been taught. The symbols glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm that matched my heartbeat, or maybe my heartbeat matched the rhythm. Impossible to tell which was driving which. In the center of the room was a table, or altar, carved from single piece of black stone, and on that altar rested a pyramid of red crystal that emanated cold, actual physical cold that made the air around it shimmer. Around the walls were tanks, cylindrical transparasteel containers filled with amber liquid, and floating in several of those tanks were things that had been human once, their bodies twisted, mutated, covered in growths that might have been organic or technological, or some fusion that defied categorization. I stood in that doorway for perhaps 10 seconds before the horror fully registered, before my mind stopped trying to recontextualize what I was seeing into something innocuous and simply accepted the reality. This was a Sith facility. This sublevel that had been constructed beneath the noble estate was a place where dark side experiments were conducted, where force-sensitive children were brought not for rescue, but for corruption or worse, where Dooku's true allegiance and true nature were made explicit. He wasn't a disillusioned Jedi working for political reform. He was something else, something that had either hidden its nature from the beginning or had transformed during the years I'd served him, incrementally surrendering his principles and identity to whatever power the dark side offered. I ran, back up the stairway, through the storage room, into the estate's main levels, my mind fracturing with the effort of processing what I'd seen while simultaneously trying to deny it, explain it away, make it something other than what it was. I made it to my quarters, locked the door, sat on my bed shaking while nausea rolled through me in waves. Every rationalization I'd constructed over nearly 2 years collapsed. Every justification I'd accepted revealed itself as lie. The separatist movement wasn't about reform, it was about destabilization, about creating chaos Dooku could exploit, for purposes I couldn't fully grasp, but that clearly involved resurrecting or perpetuating Sith ideology. The noble ideals he'd articulated were propaganda, tools for recruiting useful idiots like me, people whose genuine grievances with the Republic could be weaponized into supporting something far worse. I should have left that night, should have fled the estate and Sereno and contacted the Republic with everything I knew. But I was terrified, paralyzed by fear and shame in equal measure. Fear of what Dooku would do if I tried to leave. Shame at how completely I'd been deceived, how much I'd contributed to something monstrous while believing I was serving justice. I convinced myself I needed to be strategic, to plan carefully, to gather more evidence before acting. Really, I was just frozen, unable to proceed forward or backward, trapped by my own complicity. Dooku returned 3 days later. He summoned me to his office immediately upon arrival, and when I entered, I knew that he knew I'd seen the sublevel, knew from the way he looked at me, the way his presence felt different now that I understood what he was. Or maybe it had always felt this way, and I'd simply lacked the framework to interpret the sensations correctly. The cold pressure in the air around him, the sense of depth behind his eyes, like looking into a well that had no bottom, the way shadows seemed darker in his presence, more textured, almost alive. "You went below," he said, not a question. I couldn't lie, couldn't force words through my constricted throat. I nodded. He regarded me silently for a long moment, and during that moment I felt something brushing against my thoughts, probing gently, and I understood he was using the Force to read my mind, to assess whether I was irredeemably horrified or merely shocked in ways that could be managed. I tried to control my thoughts, to project calm acceptance, but I've never been Force-sensitive and had no training in mental discipline. Everything I felt was available to him, my horror and disgust and shame and terror. "You're afraid," he observed. "Good. Fear is clarifying. It burns away comfortable delusions and reveals what's real. Let me tell you what's real, Genza. The Republic is failing, has been failing for decades, held together only by Jedi enforcement and core world exploitation. The collapse is inevitable. The only question is whether that collapse will be uncontrolled chaos that consumes billions in senseless violence, or whether it will be managed, directed, transformed into something new and stronger. I am working to ensure the latter. Yes, the methods are harsh. Yes, the philosophy I've embraced is not the light side compassion of the Jedi, but the dark side is not evil. It's simply power without self-imposed limitation, and power is what's required to reshape galactic civilization. "Those children," I said, my voice barely functional. "What are you doing to them?" "Training them," he said. "The Jedi would take Force-sensitive children and suppress their emotions, their attachments, their natural drives, creating emotionally crippled servants of a corrupt order. I'm teaching them to embrace their full potential, to access the strength that comes from emotion rather than fearing it. Some cannot handle the training, yes, some break. That's unfortunate but inevitable. You cannot forge steel without heat and pressure." "That's not training," I said. "That's torture, that's—" I couldn't finish, couldn't articulate what I'd seen because my vocabulary didn't contain words adequate to the reality. "That's preparation for a harsh galaxy," he said. "You think compassion will save them. You think Jedi detachment will protect them. The galaxy is brutal, Genza. It devours the weak. I'm ensuring these children become strong enough to survive and to serve the new order that's emerging. You can understand this or not, but you cannot leave. You know too much. Your choice is to continue serving with full knowledge of what we're building, or to become another unfortunate casualty of this transition. I would prefer the former. You've been valuable, and your idealism, properly directed, could continue to be useful, but I will not hesitate to choose the latter if necessary." It wasn't really a choice. Stay and serve a Sith Lord in constructing whatever nightmare he was building, or refuse and die. I chose survival. I'm not proud of it. But when confronted with immediate death versus abstract complicity, most people choose survival. I told him I would stay, would continue my work, would keep what I'd learned confidential. He smiled, that same courteous smile I'd found reassuring years before, and said he knew I would make the rational decision, that I was too intelligent to let squeamishness override self-preservation. The next 3 months were psychological torture more refined than anything physical could have been. I continued my duties, managing schedules, coordinating communications, processing the endless administrative requirements of a growing military-political movement, all while knowing what the movement actually was, what it served, what would be built on the foundation of suffering I was helping to organize. Dooku treated me exactly as he had before, courteous and respectful, occasionally asking my opinion on tactical matters, including me in planning sessions. But now I understood it was performance, manipulation, him demonstrating his control by forcing me to maintain normalcy while my conscience disintegrated. The nightmares intensified. Every night I walked through impossible corridors, through rooms where the children screamed, through spaces where Dooku stood teaching them to access power through pain, through their own suffering and the suffering they inflicted on each other, his voice calm and pedagogical while describing techniques for drawing on rage, on hate, on fear, transforming emotion into force power. I woke gasping, sometimes screaming, always with the sense that the dreams weren't entirely dreams, but actual psychic bleed-through, that being this close to concentrated dark side practice was affecting my mind even though I wasn't force-sensitive, like radiation exposure damaging cells without being felt. I started planning escape, carefully, incrementally, doing nothing that might trigger suspicion. I diverted small amounts of credits from discretionary accounts into untraceable holdings. I researched remote worlds in the Outer Rim where someone could disappear. I created false identities, forged credentials, established backup communications channels, and I documented everything, every meeting I attended, every transmission I processed, every financial arrangement I managed, encrypting it all and storing copies in multiple locations, insurance against my own erasure. Month 34, Geonosis entered the planning. I processed the communications arranging the summit, all the major separatist leaders gathering at a single location to formalize the confederacy of independent systems. The scale of what was being organized was staggering. Not a political movement, but an actual parallel government with military capabilities that rivaled the Republic. Armies of battle droids, fleets of warships, industrial capacity from the galaxy's largest corporate entities. This wasn't rebellion or reform. This was manufactured war, a conflict being constructed deliberately. And sitting in those planning sessions, I finally understood the full scope of what Dooku had been building. He wanted the war, not as unfortunate consequence, but as explicit goal. The chaos and suffering weren't side effects, but the point. Mechanisms for sweeping away the old order and installing something new in the vacuum. I asked him about it directly in one of our last private conversations, 3 weeks before Geonosis. We were reviewing security arrangements for the summit, and I simply asked, "Why are you doing this? What's the actual objective?" He considered the question seriously, decided I'd earned explanation, or decided I was already too complicit to be dangerous with additional knowledge. I'm not sure which. "The Jedi have served the Republic for 1,000 generations," he said. "In that time, they've forgotten what they were meant to be. They've become complacent, ritualistic, more concerned with maintaining tradition than actually serving the Force. They need to be tested, purified through crisis, reminded of their purpose. This war will accomplish that. It will also eliminate the corruption that's metastasized in the Senate, destroy the systems that allow exploitation and injustice to flourish unchallenged. What emerges afterward will be stronger, more just, more aligned with the Force's true nature." "And what about all the people who'll die in this purifying war?" I asked. "Regrettable," he said without affect. "But consider the alternative. Continued slow decay, suffering distributed across centuries, billions living in oppression and injustice, while institutions meant to protect them rot from within. Sometimes you must amputate the infected limb to save the patient. I'm performing surgery on galactic civilization. It's painful, yes, but necessary for long-term health." "You sound like you're talking about livestock, not people," I said. "I'm talking about civilization," he corrected, "about grand patterns that operate across generations and star systems. Individual suffering is tragic, but it's also inevitable and ultimately meaningless, except in how it contributes to larger outcomes. You have to learn to think in scales beyond the personal genza. That's what separates leaders from followers, the ability to make necessary calculations without being paralyzed by sentiment. I looked at him and saw clearly what he'd become, or perhaps what he'd always been beneath the noble aesthetics I'd projected onto him. He wasn't a reformer or a revolutionary or even a villain with tragic motivations. He was something worse, a person who'd convinced himself that his own will was identical with cosmic justice, that his vision justified any methodology, that he was beyond moral accountability because he operated on a plane above ordinary ethics. He'd transformed himself into an instrument of something he called the Force, but that was really just his own megalomaniacal certainty, and in doing so, he'd surrendered the humanity that might have created limits, checks, restraints on what he was willing to do. I left 10 days before Geonosis, waited until he traveled off-world for preliminary meetings, collected the documents and credits I'd prepared, and simply departed. Took a commercial transport to the nearest hyperspace junction, switched to a cargo hauler heading rimward, switched again to a passenger liner, then to private transports, covering my trail through a dozen jumps until I reached Ryloth, where I used one of my false identities to secure passage on a refugee transport heading to neutral space. It took 19 days to reach relative safety, and during every moment of those days, I expected assassins to appear, expected to feel the cold pressure that indicated Dooku had located me through whatever dark side techniques he possessed, expected my escape to fail. It didn't fail. I reached the outer rim, established myself on a backwater world called Ord Mantell, got work under a false name doing administrative tasks for a small trading company, tried to build a life from the fragments of who I'd been before 7 years of serving a Sith Lord had destroyed my capacity for trust or hope or anything resembling normal human emotion. Then came the war, Geonosis, the Republic's clone army, the battle droids. Everything Dooku had planned erupting into galactic conflict. I watched the holonet reports with sick recognition, seeing the patterns I'd helped coordinate, manifesting in military movements and political maneuvering. The suffering he'd predicted and orchestrated, the surgery he'd described, playing out across the galaxy in the form of billions dead, entire worlds destroyed, civilization tearing itself apart exactly as he'd intended. I tried contacting the Republic, tried providing intelligence about Dooku's real nature, his Sith allegiance, the facilities on Sereno, but what proof did I have? Encrypted files that could have been fabricated, testimony from a single disillusioned aide with no corroboration, accusations about secret sublevels and dark side experiments that sounded like paranoid conspiracy theory. The Republic's intelligence services thanked me for my information and did nothing, or perhaps they did something and it was insufficient, I don't know. The war continued. Dooku continued. The separatist movement I'd helped build continued killing in the name of independence and reform. The assassins came 6 months after Geonosis. I survived the first attempt through luck, being in a different location than expected when they struck. The second attempt I survived through paranoia, having established multiple bolt holes and never sleeping in the same place twice. The third attempt nearly succeeded. They cornered me in a market district. Would have killed me if a random explosion from nearby gang violence hadn't created enough chaos for me to escape. After that, I ran again, changed worlds, changed identities, changed everything about my life except the guilt. I learned about his death through the holonet 3 years into the war. Lord Tyrannus, his Sith name, I learned later, assigned by whoever was actually orchestrating this conflict from behind Dooku as puppet master, killed by Anakin Skywalker aboard the Invisible Hand above Coruscant. The reports were brief, matter of fact, just another development in the ongoing war. I felt nothing, no relief, no satisfaction, no sense of justice achieved. Just emptiness. He was gone, but the war continued. The suffering continued. The systems he'd built kept functioning without him, revealing that he'd always been ultimately dispensable. Another tool like me, like Gunray, like everyone he'd manipulated, all of us serving a design we couldn't fully see. I think about him often, about the man he'd been, or the man I'd believed he was in those early months. Was there ever a genuine Count Dooku who wanted to reform the Republic, who left the Jedi Order because he couldn't reconcile his principles with their complicity in corruption? Or was that always a mask, a performance, the dark side user concealed beneath noble rhetoric? I don't know. Maybe he didn't know himself by the end. Maybe the transformation was so gradual that even he couldn't identify where one identity ended and another began. What I do know is that noble intentions are no protection against corruption, that idealism can be weaponized, that the most dangerous monsters often begin as visionaries convinced their ultimate goals justify any intermediate step. Dooku taught me that, not through his words about power and necessity, but through the object lesson of his own trajectory from Jedi Master to Sith Lord, to corpse floating in space above Coruscant, having achieved nothing except suffering on unimaginable scale. I'm still running. The war ended, the Empire emerged, but the assassins still come occasionally, suggesting someone considers my knowledge dangerous enough to be worth suppressing even years later. Maybe it's Imperial intelligence tying up loose ends. Maybe it's surviving elements of Dooku's network, protecting their own complicity. It doesn't matter. I move when I need to move, work when I can, exist in the gaps between Imperial surveillance and criminal territories, carrying the testimony of what I witnessed, what I enabled, what I helped build. Sometimes in the night I still hear the children screaming, those Force-sensitive children brought to Sereno's sub-level for Dooku's experiments in dark side indoctrination. I wonder what happened to them, whether any survived, whether they're out there now as inquisitors or Imperial servants or dark side practitioners themselves, carrying forward the corruption he initiated, or whether they all died in the training, broken by methods designed to forge strength but that mostly just destroyed, their bodies disposed of and their deaths justified as necessary casualties in the grand design. I tell myself I did what I could, that I was young and idealistic and deceived by someone far more experienced in manipulation. I tell myself that individual responsibility dissolves in the face of systematic evil, that I was just one small part of a machine too large for any single person to stop. I tell myself these things and don't believe them. I was there. I saw. I helped. I chose survival over resistance, chose complicity over defiance, chose to preserve myself at the cost of enabling atrocities I knew were wrong. That's what Dooku's true corruption accomplished. Not just the political destabilization and manufactured war and dark side experiments, but the transformation of people like me, idealists who became accomplices, who learned to rationalize horror until the capacity for moral judgment atrophied completely. He didn't just fall to the dark side himself. He pulled others down with him, created cascading corruption that extended far beyond his own actions, recruiting and shaping an entire network of people who told themselves they were serving justice while actually serving something that wore justice as a mask. The devastating part isn't that he became a monster, it's that he made me one too, not through force or coercion, but through the slow erosion of conscience, the incremental acceptance of unacceptable things until I no longer recognized myself in the mirror. His noble soul, if it ever existed, wasn't just corrupted but weaponized, turned into a mechanism for corrupting others, for recruiting genuine grievance into service of manufactured catastrophe. I carry that knowledge now, carry the memory of who I was before and who I became during, carry the testimony of transformation witnessed from the inside. It doesn't redeem anything, it doesn't save anyone, but maybe it serves as warning for whoever finds this eventually, whoever reads this account and wonders how such things happen, how noble causes become atrocities, how good people become complicit in evil. This is how, gradually, incrementally, through small compromises that seem reasonable in isolation, but that accumulate into moral catastrophe, through serving charismatic leaders without questioning their foundations, through accepting simple answers to complex questions, through choosing comfort over conscience, security over resistance, belonging over independence. Dooku's corruption wasn't primarily about his personal fall to the dark side. It was about the system of corruption he created, the network of complicity he built, the way he turned idealism itself into a mechanism for recruiting suffering's architects. His noble soul, whatever that phrase means, wasn't just corrupted but perverted into instrument for corrupting others, for demonstrating that nobility and monstrosity aren't opposites but points on a spectrum anyone can traverse, given sufficient motivation and rationalization. I survived him. I escaped. I'm still here, still carrying the testimony, still trying to warn anyone who will listen that the most dangerous evil comes dressed as righteousness, that the cruelest suffering is inflicted by people convinced they're serving justice, that the greatest betrayals are committed by those we trust to lead us toward better worlds. That's what Count Dooku taught me in 7 years of service, not the philosophy he articulated or the vision he described, but the demonstration of how easily either can become justification for any atrocity, any cruelty, any crime against life itself, and I helped him do it. That's the truth I carry, the confession I repeat to myself in the darkness when sleep won't come and the children are screaming again in memory. I saw what he was becoming, and I stayed. I knew what we were building, and I continued. I chose survival over resistance. That's my corruption, the way his poison spread to everyone it touched, not through force powers or dark side techniques, but through the simple expedient of making complicity seem rational, of normalizing horror until it became just another aspect of doing business, of transforming moral questions into practical calculations where the only variable that mattered was effectiveness. The Count's noble soul was devastating not in its fall but in its weaponization, its transformation into tool for demonstrating that nobility itself was malleable, corruptible, that the highest ideals could be bent into service of the lowest practices. I'm still running from that truth, from my role in that demonstration, still trying to outpace the guilt, the memory, the knowledge of exactly how easy it was to become what I became. Still failing, still running, still carrying this testimony toward no particular destination, except perhaps toward whoever needs to understand that corruption isn't binary, isn't a dramatic fall but an incremental surrender, isn't about being evil but about stopping to question whether what you're doing serves what you claim to believe. Dooku stopped questioning. I stopped questioning, and in that silence, atrocity became routine, became policy, became the foundation of systems that consumed millions and called it necessary. That's the devastation, not the fall itself, but the spread, the way corruption metastasizes through everyone it touches, turning witness into accomplice, turning helper into enabler, turning idealist into architect of exactly the suffering she'd hoped to prevent. I enabled that. I was that. I am that, still, always will be, no matter how far I run or how long I survive. This is my confession. This is my testimony. This is my warning. This is what remains when noble souls corrode and take everyone around them down into darkness too.